What's up, Josh Feuerstein here. So I'm here to issue the $100,000 Atheist Challenge.
While we both know you don't have 100th of that, why not?
Challenge accepted. No.
Hey everyone, JL here, and welcome back to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. So that was far-right evangelical internet personality Joshua Feuerstein. A lot of you may remember him from some of the controversial content that he's created in the past.
Because marriage is constituted as one man, one woman. There's no such thing as gay marriage.
Look, I need to explain to you why what Obama and the Supreme Court just did in legalizing gay marriage in all 50 states, literally usurping the authority of each individual state, is the beginning of the Christian Holocaust.
I think it's time that abortion doctors should have to run and hide and be afraid for their life. So when I went in and I asked for my coffee, they asked for my name, and I told them my name is Merry Christmas. So guess what? Starbucks, I tricked you. You don't have to wear the mask. You got Jesus. You don't need the vaccine. You got Jesus.
Feuerstein has also made a rather ridiculous name for himself as a proponent of extreme and violent Christian evangelism. And while he hasn't really been all that relevant for a while, his last video was uploaded to his channel 7 years ago, he has enjoyed a modicum of recent success as another alt-right caustic personality that we can all laugh at. Most recently, he got himself investigated by the FBI for inciting comments that he had made on January 6th.
And so today I stand with the Black Robe Regiment, and I am one preacher declaring to patriots, it is time for war.
Now, the video that we're going to look at today was sent to me by a friend. And while it is quite old, published back in 2014, I am always up for a challenge, so I figured I'd take a look and see if I could win some of Feuerstein's Monopoly money. So let's dive in and see if this mirror universe Kevin James has brought anything new to the table.
What's up, Josh Feuerstein here. So I'm here to issue the $100,000 Atheist Challenge to anybody that could provide me proof or evidence that God does not exist.
So normally I'd point out that it seems like Josh is being intentionally vague with his God. Due to his evangelical beliefs, we can assume with some confidence that he's talking about the Christian triune God. But that's where things get complicated. Depending on how you define it, there's a wide variety of Christian gods to choose from, ranging from the immaterial and purely metaphysical deity to the often pissy, extortionist omni-thunder god. So, given Josh's particular views on abortion, the government, and LGBTQ, and his propensity for creating drama and his love of outrage culture, I think it's safe to say he's probably a Baptist of the new IBF variety. Luckily for me, all of that is irrelevant because I have a secret weapon.
I think it's rather ridiculous that there's been people for a long time that have said that God does not exist, and yet they're unarmed because they have zero evidence and zero proof.
Not even 20 seconds and already shifting the burden of proof. Come on, Josh. Atheism is just the result of rejecting theism. A claim has to be made for it to be rejected. People claim there is a God. Those that reject that claim are by definition atheists. You also know full well that the majority of atheists come to that conclusion due to a lack of sufficient evidence to support the claim, or just straight bad argumentation to justify its existence. Atheists are not making the claim that anything in the God category exists. They're just rejecting your claim that it does. It's up to you, the theist, to demonstrate how you know it to be true without fallacious reasoning. And you know you can't, which is why you shifted the burden of proof to the atheist to prove a negative. And I will bet my fake winnings that Josh thinks he has this in the bag.
How would that ever hold up in a court of law?
Hey Josh, Bertrand Russell has a teapot he'd like to talk to you about.
You know, it's funny, I was talking to an atheist the other day, and he told me, he said, I don't believe that there's any such thing as absolute truth. I said, you really believe that?
It's a challenging question, to be sure, even for the most sure-footed philosopher.
He said, absolutely. I said, therefore, you now have absolute truth.
Actually, that atheist doesn't. But it doesn't matter because both you and they are wrong. Your attempt to play into their error has made you both look philosophically ignorant. When it comes to the possession of knowledge, one can only be certain that they don't know everything. Because they don't, and by virtue of the nature of the universe, will never possess all knowledge, then never knowing everything becomes an absolute truth. So the atheist should have said that they truthfully know absolutely that they do not possess all absolute truths. Whether this story is made up or not, it doesn't make Josh look nearly as good as he thinks it does. I'd strongly recommend he spend a little time with the Republic.
If you absolutely believe that there is no such thing as absolute truth, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, the atheist you were speaking to misspoke, Josh. Still doesn't mean that you have any evidence any God exists.
You live in a dichotomy, a paradigm, a problem, and a paradox.
Well, someone stole a thesaurus for this video, because you know he'd never buy one.
You see, if we were to look at absolute truth, and we were to look at the totality of all knowledge, all scientific facts, everything, and we were to be able to draw a circle that would represent it, it would look something like this.
Oh, you're going to go with the fallacious exercise that Pastor Glenn Barrett embarrassed himself with. Ballsy. Uninspired and unoriginal, but ballsy.
Broad and expansive and large.
I could name something else that is, too.
And yet it is that if you were to draw a circle of everything that you know, every experience, every scientific fact that you've ever learned, whether in school or study, it would probably look something more like this.
This has always been a weird exercise, mostly because it's presented in such a convoluted way. And please forgive me, as this may get a little heady, but I'll try and sum it up as best I can. The easiest way to think about this is in terms of propositions that are true or false. The large circle on the diagram contains all true propositions. So the logic of it is this: if a proposition is in the circle, then it is true. You don't know every proposition in the circle. If there are some propositions in the circle that you don't know, then God exists could be one of them. The proposition, God exists, could be true. As far as syllogisms go, I have definitely heard worse. But all this argument is really saying is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That you can't rule out the possibility that something exists just because you don't know if it actually exists. But this is pretty much the case for everything. Josh, unfortunately, is not saying anything new here. However, the real problem is with the diagram itself, because it actually presents a wholly different argument from the one initially presented. What the diagram is basically saying is that there is more you don't know than you do know. If there's more you don't know than you know, then for any proposition you don't know, it's more likely it's in the large circle. You don't know whether God exists, so it's more likely that the proposition God exists is in the circle than not. So it's more likely God exists. Now, if you spotted the glaring error in that syllogism, give yourself a pat on the back because you understand logic better than Josh here does. And of course, for Josh's education, what I'm talking about is that train wreck of a second premise. Because if that premise is true, it basically implies that anything you don't already know is more likely to be true than not. Which is ridiculous because it could technically apply to anything you could possibly conceive. Which would mean it's more likely than not that the flying spaghetti monster exists. The truth is, there is no way to reason that God's existence is more likely just because there is more we don't know than we know. This entire circle of knowledge argument, in my opinion, is by far the best demonstration of the true nature of religion. It's a complete and total con.
Now, don't you think it's ironic that there's people that have lived in this little circle their entire life that are trying to claim that there's no God that exists outside of their knowledge?
Nice misrepresentation of atheism there, Josh. And holding your everyday atheist to the expectation that they can wax poetic on the nuances of epistemology, JTB, and Gettier cases is not noble. It's dishonest. But don't sweat it, bud. That's why I'm here.
Therefore, because they've never experienced him, he doesn't exist. Now, the problem with truth and absolute truth is I believe that this generation doesn't like that concept because it means that there's moral law. It means that now that there's something that they will one day have to answer to.
Again, with the blatant misrepresentation. And badly butchering the book of Romans is not going to help you here, Josh. Come on now, let's get to the challenge.
In fact, if you were to ask an atheist, I don't think he would ever actually be able to condemn something like the Holocaust and the killing of millions and millions of innocent people. Why? Because he just believes that they're an accident. They're just merely some molecular structure, that they're just part of this scientific thing called evolution.
Always with Godwin's law, these guys. And I guess throwing it completely out the window is one way to solve the Euthyphro dilemma.
Survival of the fittest. Well, how then was Hitler just not the fittest.
Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, he wasn't the fittest, because he didn't survive to reproduce.
How can you ever condemn something like that?
Well, there's two answers there, and neither one of them requires a god. The first is empathy. I myself can only imagine what it might be like to be crushed underneath the boots of fascist hatred. So I am able to empathize deeply with the unimaginable scores of my fellow human beings who were crushed under that totalitarian regime, and my heart breaks for them at the thought. The second is, in its own way, less poetic and purely scientific. For a species to survive, genetic diversity is paramount. When vast numbers of human beings are wiped out, our gene pool grows less diverse. So removing massive swaths of genetic diversity from the gene pool pushes our species ever closer towards its extinction. If that man had fully accomplished his goals, it's likely our species would not have survived the effort. And in light of this fact, and Josh's abhorrent diminishment of the Holocaust, it must be restated that that man justified his unspeakable atrocities with an appeal to the Christian God. Smoke on that little fact for a while, Josh, and let's get to the challenge. Because now I'm really gonna embarrass you.
In fact, I would challenge you this. If you were to look around the world in any society, in almost any country, in any sets of laws, murder is something that is illegal.
Josh doesn't seem to realize that the societal definition of murder has vastly changed over the past 2 millennia.
Why is it something that is illegal universally?
Murder wasn't always universally illegal. Humans once lived in much smaller groups, so intergroup murder was likely discouraged because it would have affected the chances of the group's survival. But those rules likely only applied to members of the group and did not apply to outsiders with which the group competed directly with for resources. The earliest depiction of murder being prohibited and punishable by death was between 2100 and 2050 BCE in the Sumerian Code. And it wouldn't be until 7th century Greece when Athenian lawmaker Draco would introduce the concept of manslaughter. What Josh is referring to here is how in the Bible it states that God made it unlawful for murder to be committed by putting it in the 10 Commandments. But that reasoning is logically fallacious because it begs the question of God's very existence to make such a ruling.
Because man knows it's wrong to murder someone else.
Do they though? Because if your God commands it to be done, then all bets are off.
If we were just some biological concept as far as a human being and a man, how would we have that knowledge?
It's not knowledge, Josh. It's called empathy, and it's an evolved emotional response to those that we have identified with. It was referred to as written on the heart in the book of Romans because it was an ignorant, albeit poetic way to describe the emotion. But we can be pretty sure that empathy didn't apply when your God was commanding the genocide of the Canaanites, did it? Which is not something that ever actually occurred because their descendants occupy what is now Lebanon. So no, humans don't inherently know that murder is wrong. Because while I, an atheist, will say it's inherently wrong because it's an ultimately useless act regardless of the circumstances, a believer would say it was inherently a good thing if they believed that God had commanded it. So which of us do you think is being intellectually honest, Josh?
Except that the Bible says that God writes those precepts upon our hearts.
More butchered Romans, more begging the question.
How is it that every society around the world would agree that murder is wrong?
False equivalence. Contemporary interpretations don't even remotely apply to those of antiquity.
In fact, I guarantee that if there were no laws and no government, that you would feel wrong inside of you killing somebody. Why?
If it were someone close to me, empathy. If it were a total stranger, despite my personal disgust, it depends upon the circumstances.
Because God's written it on your heart.
Logical reasoning really isn't his strong suit.
That is why Jesus is the absolute truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And I challenge you today to have an honest conversation with him.
Begs the question of Christ's existence after death and an ability to communicate via supernatural means. Which means Josh is just advocating for people to talk to themselves. Beyond this point, Josh limply begs people to just believe in God first, and then God will reveal itself. Which of course would be indistinguishable from confirmation bias. Regardless, I'm ready to embarrass him now and collect my Monopoly money. The challenge was, prove that God does not exist. Now earlier, I stated that the God that Josh was referring to was the Christian triune God. This is important because a distinction has to be made between standard deism and Christian theism. Deism, of course, remains an unfalsifiable hypothesis. I cannot prove or disprove that a sufficiently powerful enough entity kicked the football on the universe and then fucked off, leaving no evidence of its existence. If Josh is referring to deism, then the challenge cannot be completed, and he's just being his usual trollish self. But we do know that Josh is an evangelical extremist, so we're going to go with the Christian triune God, as it's a far easier myth to dispel. Now, this can be done with either logic or science. And I'm going to go with logic, because Josh's video was based upon a logical argument, and I'm going to show him that logic actually defeats his argument, more specifically, the logical entailments of his God. Josh's God possesses what are called the omni properties: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and omnipresence. Fortunately, we only need to look at two of them: omniscience and omnipotence. Let's make sure we break these down a little bit more so that our definitions are very clear. In an infinite range of possibly true propositions, the actually true ones are the ones that are the case. For example, I have 10 choices in front of me. All 10 of them are potentially true propositions, but the only one that is actually true is the one that I choose, negating the truth of the other 9. Omniscience, or all-knowing, refers to knowing all true propositions. Omnipotence, or all-powerful, refers to being able to perform any logically consistent action without limitation. Meaning no square circles, no one-sided sticks, and no stones too heavy to lift. Now, we need only look at the entailments of those attributes and ask one simple question. Is God capable of changing its mind? It is logically consistent for any thinking agent to change its mind or its line of thought when presented with new information. But if God is omniscient, then there is no new information it can be presented with. So there is nothing that could change its mind under any circumstance. But if God also possesses the attribute of omnipotence, then logically it should be able to do so. The former attribute applies a limiter to the latter, which is a violation of its very definition. And it goes both ways. An omnipotent agent can perform any logically consistent action, including actions in which it doesn't infallibly know the true proposition of the outcome. Omniscience and omnipotence are logically contradictory states. And because the laws of logic are affirmed by their negation, meaning we know them to be true because they cannot be false, then we know logical contradictions cannot exist. So, the Christian triune God, as defined in Josh's worldview, cannot exist. From here, based upon what I've presented, Josh is then faced with the only 3 intellectually honest conclusions. 1, deism, because it's unfalsifiable. 2, atheism, because humans dreamed up God to explain things they didn't understand and made it the most powerful thing they could think of without realizing the logical consequences. Or 3, dystheism, because God is a malevolent entity and everything we know about it has been a lie perpetuated to make us love and worship it. Whichever the choice, Josh's Christian God cannot exist. And any attempt of his to get around these logical entailments and keep those properties intact would just be special pleading. For those more empirically minded, there is also the science side of this.
Yes, science!
And that argument comes to the same conclusions as the logic one. It accomplishes this by looking at the empirical consequences of a God possessing these attributes on reality itself. Because if an omniscient entity actually existed and interacted with our reality, then nothing that we understand as fundamental, from the uncertainty relations of quantum mechanics to the very laws of thermodynamics, would continue to hold true. But honestly, a deeper dive into that is for another video. Oh, and Josh, cash or money order only. I don't take checks or plastic. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And because YouTube's algorithm absolutely sucks, be sure to leave your questions or comments below. And as you may have noticed, my beard is red this month, and that's because April is Autism Acceptance Month. A link on how to support these efforts is down in the description. Oh, and if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 3rd season. All the links you need to become a channel member, nab some official Bridge the Divide gear, or support the podcast are in the description below. Once again, thank you all very much for your continued support. And as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together, we can bridge the divide.
That's science!